Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 45. I am the show's host, Kyle, and thank you everybody who's sharing this show. It's really cool to see this show grow and get out there to new people. However, one of the things I've noticed that comes along with the show getting out there to some new people is that I'm getting some different kind of feedback sometimes. Recently I was called, or it was implied that I hate America and that somebody wouldn't listen to my podcast because I'm just spewing hate against America, and I'm somehow reflective of the Trump administration that I have been very critical of, and that she loves her country, and so obviously saying that she can't listen to my podcast because she loves the country, and somehow listening to my podcast would impact this. And so I think I actually would like to respond to this for a minute and just say my intention is not to hate America whatsoever. Actually, my argument typically is that Americans' foreign policy is bad for Americans. I've broken this down a few times, but the first and the biggest way that Americans' foreign policy is harmful to Americans is because of blowback. Blowback is the idea that is endorsed by the CIA as being a real concept, and that is foreign policy interactions overseas has blowback in the home country. And so when you look at situations where you go and wage an aggressive war and you occupy a state, somewhere along the line you're really going to piss off a couple people in that country. Maybe rightly or wrongly. Maybe it's a case where you didn't do what you're being accused of doing as a country, or maybe it's a case of where you did kill a lot of civilians, and while you had the best of intentions, which I'm not endorsing is always the case with the USA, but even if you do endorse that, the US had the best of intentions of going to Afghanistan, when you kill tens and thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of civilians, then somewhere in that batch you're gonna upset a person who maybe lost a family or a husband or a wife or whatever, or saw his whole village be destroyed by warfare, and that person is gonna kind of be insane, and that person will attack the country back, and sometimes the only way for them to do that is to either carry out terrorist attacks against U.S. troops, so like walking up to a checkpoint and blowing themselves up, or if possible, getting to the United States and then inflicting damage on the civilian population here as in their mind revenge for what happened. Now, look, I have said over and over again on this podcast that obviously a terrorist doesn't have the moral justification to do what they do. But a lot of people act without morality, and some people are able to act in a way that really bends morality. And I think you could see this not only in the jihadists, but in just typical people, when you have murders carried out, when somebody, has their wife cheat on them and then they go and they kill either their wife or their wife's lover. Obviously, there's no moral justification for that. However, you also can't deny the fact that had the affair not been going on in the first place, then the murder wouldn't have taken place. And so there are some people in the world, when they get really, really angry, they are willing to let themselves die in order to inflict pain on other people. They're that mad, they have that much hate that's what they're gonna do. And the more people that you anger and the more people that you really make mad by killing their loved ones, the more occurrences you're gonna get of these crazy people. I certainly think that most jihadists are pretty nutty and are probably not good and decent people, but people with a lot of hate, and so they go and they carry out this hate against the civilian population, and it's a numbers game. It's gonna happen, and the only way to prevent the terror is to not carry out the foreign wars in the first place. Look, nothing you're ever going to do is going to clean up all violence, because some people, there's some people that are just insane. Sometimes bad things happen to people. Maybe somebody accidentally runs over somebody's child, and then that person goes and kills that man or one of that man's child or something like that. Like, the bad things are going to happen. There's nothing you do to prevent all of them. However, you can seriously lower the chances of bad things happening by not going around the world bombing people, because like I said, when that happens, you kill civilians. When you kill civilians, you end up with terrorists, and when you end up with terrorists, some of them are going to kill people in the home country. Also, if you just look at the wealth the United States has destroyed, our own wealth by carrying out these wars. Of course, just the wealth lost to the world in general, with all the oil fields being set on fire since the United States involvement in the Middle East is huge. The destabilization of Iraq and Libya and Syria and other countries around the Middle East, embargoes against Iran, embargoes against Venezuela have all led to increased energy prices and a less efficient global market, which made it more expensive for fuel around the world, right? So you have all the oil flowing out of the Middle East, and the more destabilized the Middle East is, the more expensive it is to produce the oil. So the more the oil costs when people are buying it, and so maybe you have enough wealth lost here that the oil is just too expensive for people to be able to heat their houses, and then people freeze in the winter or something like this. And so when you consider the implications of war, you just have to look at the worldwide wealth loss by the destruction of infrastructure, bridges, roads. Like in Mosul, even when life again starts in Mosul, even when ISIS is out of the city, and even if they're able to like have no terrorists ever come back, which I highly doubt, and I think there'll be a huge problem with ISIS members in Mosul for the years to come. But even if that doesn't happen, just think there's no bridges right now crossing the Tigris River in Mosul. How much more expensive is it going to be to get food from one side of the river to the other, to trade, to communicate, to just get along with your daily lives, when for years to come they're going to be rebuilding that infrastructure, all the churches, the hospitals, the schools, the police stations, the fire stations, the doctor's offices. All this stuff was absolutely destroyed in Mosul. So life as normal will not resume for years and years to come, if it ever does. The country, the city of Mosul may be in permanent setback because there's so much destruction done that they'll just never be able to catch up, because now they don't go back to treating patients at their hospitals the same way as they did before. They still have to recover the rebuild the hospital. They have to build capital in the city. Of course, any capital that anybody had built up in the city now has to go towards rebuilding the city. You can't invest in a new factory. You just have to try the best you can to rebuild your old one. Same with the hospitals. And so the wealth loss in the world is just humongous from this. And then just look at the trading routes being shut down, the pipelines that can't run because government A is mad at government B, or because terrorists are running around some other country. The fact that oil can't easily flow from the Middle East into Europe, or from the Middle East into China or Russia, is certainly a sign that energy to the people of the world is more expensive because of the destabilization of the Middle East, and just the amount of oil that's gotten taken off the market. Remember back in 2003, I believe, the Iraqi government started saying the oil wells on fire. ISIS has certainly set a lot of oil wells on fire. Al-Qaeda has set oil wells on fire over the years. Libya, Iraq, Syria have all been destabilized for significant periods of time, and that's made it impossible for oil to get out of the country. Of course, then sometimes you have the terrorist groups like in Yemen or in Syria actually selling the oil. And so rather than this oil being sold by companies that provide good paying jobs and are decent to their employees, the money is flowing into the hands of ISIS to profit off of and to buy wars from. But if you bring it closer to home, and certainly like the energy impacts do impact American people. I remember when gas was $4 something a gallon and I was in high school and I could barely drive around anywhere because I couldn't put gas in my car. And for me, I mean, compared to what other people in the world face, where $1 worth of gas could be the difference between life and death. For me, it's just a matter of not being able to go out with my friends on the weekend. However, these are the impacts at home, or people who can't afford to keep their heat on very much during the winter because they can't afford the energy. But then also, if you look at the people who are in the military who go and serve overseas, these are some of the smartest people. A lot of engineers get recruited into the military. They look for some of the best college students to join ROTC and become kind of fast-tracked to being officers. They take many of the most athletic kids. I remember when the Army would always come to my high school, they typically targeted the football team and the sports players, looking for the most athletic among us. They target people who are headed to college, saying they're going to pay for college. And so rather than all of these people doing productive things, because if you don't have an empire, you don't need the size of the military that we have now. Maybe you could have a lot more in reserves, but you don't need, we have probably 200,000 troops stationed around the world right now. That's just an insane number. And if you look at the amount of contractors we hire to do security overseas, we're just sending an awful lot of people to do security, which isn't as productive as a job as designing something new or or building a building or something like that. Unfortunately, while security is important, the less you could spend on security, the more you could spend on other infrastructure and research and development, which goes a further way into making a country and a society more profitable. Other issues is that we're going to spend $1.1 trillion in the 2017 to 2018 fiscal year on defense. This is going to include a large chunk, maybe even like $400 billion now, that will be spent as interest on the debt. So whoever did this most recent study actually calculated which portion of the debt is responsible to the Defense Department, because obviously if we hadn't waged all these wars, we wouldn't have built up as much debt as we have over the years. And while the debt as a whole can't be attributed to the Defense Department, a large portion of it can, and when you calculate that, and like I said, $1.1 trillion will be spent on defense next year. Now, I'm not somebody that likes taxation, so my solution would be, well, you just tax the American people less, maybe $750,000 billion or so, and you say that let the people save that money. But even if you're the big government type that likes a lot of spending, then look, this is money that could go to be much more helpful to the American people by either giving more money to the VA, giving it to homeless people, giving it to people who need food, whatever. I think if you're ever able to ask anybody what's a better use of money, blowing up a house in Afghanistan or feeding a couple 100,000 people, providing a couple 100,000 meals, then obviously the answer is providing a couple 100,000 meals. And so the wealth loss from the U.S. intervention as foreign policy, especially since 2001, is just incalculable. There is no way to ever know how much human productivity has been lost, because we wasted so many lives, so much money, so much time, so much effort, so much brilliant human knowledge to figuring out better ways to destroy other people. And of course, I'm not a pacifist, and I understand that there is a need for some security. And so I don't necessarily advocate for a huge defense budget, but if there's going to be one, I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't need to be $1.1 trillion. Another way that the terror war has been bad for Americans is it's just been an utter failure. If you look at anything that they promised when we are getting into the terror war, any reason why we should enter the terror war has been worse, not better. So let's say goals of the Afghanistan war would have been to kick the Taliban out of the country and install a new pro-democracy government. While there is a new government there, Afghanistan is bleeding. The government lost 10 soldiers, I believe, on Tuesday, and then another 13 on Thursday, it looks like. A German aid worker was killed, an Afghan police officer was killed, and then a Finnish aid worker was kidnapped there. Of course, there's wild speculation by U.S. generals saying that Russia is getting involved with the Taliban, but that's been proven not true. And so when you just look at this and look at how poorly things are going in Afghanistan, none of the things they promised are happening there. The government there is only supported by America. There is not a stable Afghan government that can exist without the support of America. The Taliban control more ground there than in 2001. ISIS Khorasan group is now a large threat there. The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is still extremely and probably more porous now than ever before. The U.S. has carried out drone strikes and airstrikes. In fact, we carried out more airstrikes this April than in any month since August of 2012 with 460. That's 7 times more than was carried out by the U.S. in April of 2016. And of course, if you go back to August 2012, the last time that more airstrikes were carried out, that was during the Obama surge years. And so if the U.S. policy that was promised to us in 2001 with that authorization use of military force obviously hasn't happened. Iraq's a mess. Saddam Hussein versus ISIS, as far as it goes for which is better for the U.S. people, Saddam Hussein sold us oil and fought Iran for us. ISIS has thrown suicide bombers and attackers at the United States. So I think it's pretty clear if you're an American citizen which one you would rather have. And I think most Iraqis were probably better off before than after. Millions of people have now died, and the standard of living in the country has plummeted. Of course, you have the country more segregated than ever before. The Shia have taken over Baghdad. The Anbar province is largely a poor wasteland, and the Kurds are moving towards an autonomous state in the north. In fact, we have a U.S. general saying that is now not an if but a when. The Kurds will have their own independence within Iraq. Or not within Iraq, actually. It seems like he was saying their own state. Syria, the same thing. Rather than fighting against Al-Qaeda, we've actually ended up fighting for Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Libya. The Libyan war really allowed the refugee crisis to flood over. That's been a disaster for the West and Europe and the United States. The war in Yemen, we now have Al-Qaeda controlling substantial territory in that country. At one time, they even controlled some of the oil wells, and I believe the big pipeline lead out of the country, preventing any Yemeni oil from being sold. We have drone strikes just killing civilians en masse in Yemen. Recently, a drone strike that the U.S. claimed killed 7 members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula seems to have actually killed 7 civilians. Some members of that village taught to, I believe, intercept reporters, and they kind of highlighted how these people weren't fighters with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A couple of them may have been at one time, but left the movement years ago when they realized what it was. And then we had a raid in which the U.S. claimed that 7 members of AQAP died, but in fact 5 civilians died and 2 members of the AQAP died. This one was interesting because it sounds like what happened is that the special forces were approaching a village and somebody actually went out to greet the soldiers, at which time the soldiers shot that man, perceiving him as a threat. Then other men exited the house and I guess started yelling at the U.S. soldiers saying, what the hell are you doing? That was not an enemy to you. And the conflict caused the U.S. soldiers to kill 4 other villagers, including one 69-year-old blind man. The gunfire actually drew the Al-Qaeda troops to the area, and a shootout then caused 2 of the Al-Qaeda fighters to die. And in fact, in Yemen, we're fighting on both sides of that war. We're helping Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda on one half of the war, and then on the other half of the war, we're helping the Houthi by bombing Al-Qaeda. So, absolutely a mess. The weapon sales to Saudi Arabia also had to be a huge concern if the U.S. is benefiting from our foreign policy. This is something I've highlighted in several episodes, that Saudi Arabia really doesn't have the best interests of the U.S. in mind, and I don't think really gives a damn about the U.S. people. And so for it to be in the, best interest of the American people to sell this country billions of dollars in weapons, hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons, can't absolutely be a true statement. So I think you could oppose another measure of the U.S. foreign policy there without hating America. I also think the terror war is very tough on the culture of America. It's led to a situation where we've been at war with the Muslim world for so long that a lot of Americans feel uncomfortable flying next to Muslim people, and Trump's travel ban was largely accepted by the U.S. people. And so I think, I've broken this down before, that this could be traced back to the U.S. foreign policy under Clinton and the first Bush and the second Bush and Obama, where they said, hey, Muslim people are so dangerous that we have to send your children over there to die fighting them, and we have to waste all of your money bombing them, and, we have to continue this war and sell all these weapons and do all this stuff to protect you from the Muslim people. And even if it's not the correct conclusion that Muslim people are dangerous to Americans, this is obviously the conclusion that a lot of Americans are going to draw, just because they keep being told how dangerous Muslim people are by their government, and then eventually it just infects the culture, and now you have a case where you have a population that has a fear and a bias against other people, not because of any legitimate threat, but because of a made up threat the government kept telling them. And I think this is kind of the bigger reasons of why I don't hate America, but I really don't like America's foreign policy whatsoever. I don't think it's best for Americans. If you look at any of these measures by how it is for Americans, then undoubtedly Americans are worse off now than they were before the terror war started. And that's because of Americans' foreign policy. And so if you if liking your country means you want what's best for the American people, then you should oppose the terror war, and this doesn't make me an American hater. It just makes me a concerned citizen who doesn't want to see the country destroyed. And also, I mean, look, I don't want to absolutely miss this point, but there's a huge morality issue in that a lot of times what the United States is doing overseas is absolutely amoral and absolutely horrific. If you look at some of the raids carried out in Yemen where you have mothers running with their children in their arms and getting shot in the head, and little 8-year-old girls bleeding out because a U.S. soldier shot them in the neck, and old men being shot in an argument with U.S. soldiers, these are all horrific events. What happened in Libya, what Obama and Hillary did to Libya, what Bush did to Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, the arming of the jihadists there, the selling of weapons to Saudi Arabia by pretty much every U.S. president. The absolute travesty in Somalia and Yemen where you have people starving to death because of U.S. wars there. These are all horrific policies and have no moral ground to stand on whatsoever. I'm guessing the woman who called me anti-American probably doesn't care about the people overseas that are dying, because if you do, then the really issue shouldn't be, do I hate America or not? It's just like, is this the right thing to be doing? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no. All right, there are some news stories I did want to touch on today before we get through the weekend. The first is that Trump criticized other NATO countries at a NATO speech. NATO countries agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on military. However, only 5 of the 28 NATO countries are actually meeting this target, with the U.S. meeting and exceeding the target many times over. I kind of understand why people in Trump always say like it's a big deal that the other countries aren't paying their way, but many of these countries are really small, and their contributions to military spending are so minimal anyways that the U.S. might as well just subsidize their defense, and they could just rely on the U.S. military. Jeff Flake and Tim Kaine have introduced a new authorization of use of military force. This would apply to ISIS, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. As I stated before, this is kind of a complicated issue and one that I don't have a clear opinion on. In one sense, I absolutely oppose the authorization of use of military force. I hope it doesn't pass. I think if it does, we're looking at a real potential disaster on our hands. This bill would essentially authorize Trump to use military strikes anywhere from Mali or Tunisia all the way east until you get to the Philippines, where there's an ISIS presence there now. And so when you look at this, it's absolutely terrible. However, I think this bill does delegitimize the terror war that's currently being fought based on the 2001 authorization of use of military force. I made this argument before, so I'm not going to make it here. I just want to point out that that bill was passed with the understanding that it would be used to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and since it has been used to justify countless special operations and raids across Africa, including in Somalia and Libya. It's been used to justify intervention in Syria, Iraq, post, 2012-ish, when Obama pulled out the troops from Iraq, Yemen, and Pakistan, and like I said, just a countless numbers of other African countries. And so hopefully what will happen is this bill will be voted on, will fail. I'll try to keep everybody up to date on where that is. I think the vote probably won't happen for a couple of weeks. So hopefully, if we vote on it and it fails, maybe that's at least a basis to start to challenge some of these active war on terror wars on the constitutionality basis. The Army's newest budget is requesting $6.4 million for a forward operating base in Turkey. The article I read this and really speculated on what this base will be for. I honestly don't know. They're saying THAAD missiles, but that seems like it would make Russia awfully upset, and so I doubt it. I would think I would be more skeptical that this wouldn't be used to carry out some kind of missions against Syria, maybe. This is in the early stages of the budget. Like I said, it's just an Army request. It's not even part of the Pentagon request for the budget for 2017-2018, but it is something that I think it would be beneficial if we keep on our radars. The Pentagon has released a new report now admitting that they killed 100 people in the March 17th Mosul strike. Of course, me and Will Porter really highlighted this in my interview with him in the article we wrote together. What happened was that leading up to that airstrike for several days, U.S. airstrikes in the region have forced people to pack into fewer and fewer houses as houses were being destroyed, and then the U.S. carried out an airstrike that hit one of the few remaining houses, causing an estimated 278 people to be killed. The Pentagon originally only made it to 14 people being killed in that attack, but now at least they copped to 100. Still far short of nearly a third of how many people actually died, and that's very upsetting that the government just can't be honest with the amount of death and destruction they cause overseas. I've often stated that I feel like if they're more honest about their interventions overseas, then the American people would be more likely to reject it, and then maybe I can make the case for blowback without being called anti-American. But the UK police are responding to the Manchester terror attack by putting a lot of heavily armed police on the street. That was kind of odd to see in the UK, and so I just want to mention it on the show. Some stories from earlier in the week: Turkey is looking to arrest about 144 more people in relation to the coup. I believe they had captured about 36 of these people already. I think this brings the total of people dismissed from their jobs to over 150,000 people, with several tens of thousands of people being arrested as well, maybe 50,000 now. In Syria, U.S. bombing there is causing a huge problem. Actually, for the month of May, it looks like the U.S. will have more civilian kills than Russia, and this is the 5th straight month this is occurring. The U.S. has already killed 225 civilians in Syria in May, and only 122 ISIS fighters, and of course 8 Syrian allied troops. And this doesn't include an airstrike on, I believe, Tuesday where 16 civilians died, and then another one on Thursday or Wednesday where 35 civilians died. So we have 50 or 51 Syrian civilians dying over a 2 or 3 day span. Syria and Jordan has also traded some threats, so that's just something to keep our eyes on. The U.S. carried out pretty big war games with Jordan, and I think this spooked the Syrian government a little bit. The U.S. did agree to more communications with Russia in the conflict in Syria, and so maybe both the sides of the conflict learned something with the U.S. bombing of those Syrian allied troops, and are looking for a better solution there. One more story I want to mention, not the typical foreign policy story, but it does have to do with U.S. interventionism overseas, and that is a DEA shooting in Honduras. Originally, why this story is a big deal is that 2 pregnant women and 2 other civilians were killed when a boat collided with a DEA boat on a river in Honduras. The initial story is that somebody from the civilian boat provoked the fight, but in reality what happened is that the Honduran and DEA agents fired on the innocent civilians either in confusion for another reason, and wounded several civilians, and like I said, killed 2 pregnant women and 2 other civilians. Absolute disgrace and travesty, and just another absolute disappointing thing from the terror war. Well, I think that'll do it for the show today. I hope everybody liked the show. Please consider sharing the show. The more people I get out there to, the more I think we can spread this message and hopefully end some of these wars. Listen, even if you're somebody who wants just what's best for America, then I think in today's show I make the pretty clear case that you gotta be non-interventionist, because all these foreign wars have only made life work for the American citizens. Of course, wars are bad for everybody. They cost everybody a lot of wealth, and let's end a couple of them. So share the show. The website is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Subscribe to the show on iTunes. Join the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. Like my Facebook page, Kyle's Files, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. I write at thelibertarianinstitute.org on the blog there. And I also have my own website, kylesfilesblog.com. Oh, and follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE.